Graeme MacQueen is now an emeritus professor at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, where he taught in the Department of Religious Studies and where he was a co-founder and director of McMaster's Center for Peace Studies. His work there involved repeated visits to Afghanistan in the years prior to 9/11, and as a result, he has an unusually deep insight into the nature of war in Afghanistan and the unending series of wars in that country and what the 9/11 events have meant for Afghanistan. He became seriously involved over the years since 9/11 in researching the events of the day in considerable detail. And he's given public presentations in Canada and in the United States and perhaps elsewhere, I don't know, and has written a series of important articles published in the Journal of 9/11 Studies. One of his most important areas of research has been into the Anthrax attacks that started just a week after 9/11. He's also, as I said, published papers on the testimonies by first responders at the World Trade Center to explosions occurring before the buildings disintegrated, and on their foreknowledge of destruction of WTC-7, and these are areas that we'll talk about today. And another interesting area of research that he's published a fine paper on is regarding the seismic signals that were centered on the disintegrations of the buildings. And I've read his articles, and I find them to be models of careful methodology and objectivity, and really quite excellent, and I recommend them all very highly. And as I said, the links to the articles are in the show page for today. So Graeme, this is a lot of territory to cover. I've mentioned all these things I've mentioned for a purpose, and I'd like to touch on them today. And so why don't we do a somewhat chronological approach? And I was hoping you could describe for us your personal experience of the situation in Afghanistan before 9/11 and the U.S. invasion. When did you visit Afghanistan, and what were you doing there?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. There's only one slight correction I need to make.
Okay.
Otherwise, that was a really good summary. Thank you. I didn't personally make repeated visits to Afghanistan. I was the guy who was director of the Center for Peace Studies and who was kind of the man on the ground in Canada trying to keep these projects together.
I see.
So we had field teams which made repeated visits to Afghanistan and to other war zones, by the way. I myself was only on one field trip to Afghanistan, and that's when we were trying to decide whether to set up a project there, and that was in 1995. The trip that was quite important and that I've mentioned in some of my talks was not actually in Afghanistan. The Canadian government was strongly discouraging us at that point from visiting Afghanistan. So I think the most important visit, perhaps, from our point of view today, was actually to Pakistan in February 2001. There was a very large refugee community. I think, as I recall, there were about 1.5 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan at that time, and roughly similar number in Iran. Excuse me. And so, of course, they had to think about ways of getting on with their lives. And one of the things they did was to, in Peshawar, Pakistan, across the border from Afghanistan, they set up a university called the Afghan University. And it was meant to be temporary while they were, expatriates. And that university was our partner. You always have to have a reliable partner when you do these kinds of peace work projects. So the Afghan University invited a group of us in the field of peace and conflict studies to come to Peshawar and put on several days of workshops on peacemaking and peace building. And they helped work with us to bring participants. There were about 100 participants over a 4 to 5 day period. Attendance was almost 100%. 90 were men, 10 were women. About a third were former cabinet ministers. Another third were sheikhs. Another third were professors. And we really had at it for several days, trying to figure out what to do about Afghanistan's terrible conflicts. So, as I say, that was in February 2001, which was an interesting time to be there. And it was only a few months later, of course, that 9/11 happened and the U.S. invaded. There were already rumors of U.S. military presence growing in the region when I was there in February, and during one of our big brainstorming sessions, when people were coming up with a lot of really good ideas as to how to solve that conflict. I mean, I could go through those ideas if you're interested, but a very well-dressed gentleman, almost certainly former Afghan cabinet minister, though I don't know his name, stood up and said, you're coming up with all these wonderful ideas, but my friends, I'm afraid it's all in vain, because quite soon the Americans are going to invade Afghanistan. They're after the oil. Now, whether I assumed at the time he meant the oil and gas reserves in Central Asia, I assumed he was talking about the pipeline, the so-called Tapi pipeline, which is going to go through Afghanistan. For all I know, he already knew that there were going to be big reserves in Afghanistan. But anyway, he said they're going to come, they want the oil, they're going to build big bases, and they're going to stay. And then he sat down. It was kind of
amazing.
It was a silence. There was a silence in the room, right? What do you do with that? Now, I didn't have the opportunity to follow it up, although his intervention, the words he said, are in our notes on that conference. But the man who was really leading our workshop was a world-famous peace and conflict expert, Johan Galtung. In fact, he's often called the father of peace studies, originally from Norway. Johan did follow up with the guy. He went over to his office afterwards. He looked at the various maps on the wall. He talked to him, explored this detail, and he's decided to protect the man's identity. But there's no question but that it happened. And, of course, subsequently, after that, I found out that, there were quite a few people in Asia that knew the Americans were coming. It was published in some media outlets, for example, in India, that there would be a fall offensive and the U.S. would be part of it. But we over here in North America were mostly innocent of that, and that's why we didn't know what was coming. And I'm sorry if I'm rambling on a bit here, but
no, I don't think you're rambling at all. No.
Can I just give one more rant while I'm on this?
Yes, please.
I attended a meeting in my own city here a month and a half ago or so, where 3 really fine peace activists gave talks on, where we are today and so on. And I don't want to disparage them, because I have enormous respect for all 3 of them. But all 3 of them assumed that the United States invaded Afghanistan because of 9/11, and all 3 assumed that, or appeared to assume, that, the 19 hijackers from Al-Qaeda had carried out 9/11 and so on. I was so frustrated. I mean, I eventually kind of gave an outburst, and which not a very skillful one, I'm afraid. But I thought, come on, you guys, the peace movement, which I identify with, right? We ought to know. It's almost 10 years since this event. These are basic facts we ought to know. So I told them, I said, I was warned that the Americans were going to invade in February. I was there. Okay. Anyway, I'll stop my rant now.
No, that's an important rant, and I'd like to return to this very subject of the status of the anti-war movement toward the end of the show.
Okay.
And come back to this. The reason I think what you just told us, this story that you just told us, is so important is that indeed here in the U.S. and in North America and perhaps in Western Europe, the awareness of the pre-planning of the war in Afghanistan has been very limited. And there were some accounts did trickle out about threats made against the Taliban of, you take our gold carpet or we'll bury you under a carpet of bombs, things like that. But the accounts were so few that I think yours is equally significant, equally important. It shows that people in the region, it wasn't just key insiders in the current Pakistani diplomatic establishment that were aware of it. It was something that the people in the region, and you was very interesting that you mentioned that India, actually, media in India published stories forecasting the invasion. I think this is very, very important, and this is key evidence, and I wanted you to tell us that story for that reason.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, often these things are reported in a minor and kind of offhand way in the West, as if to say, well, rumors circulated, or this very condescending thing they sometimes say, on the Arab street. Have you ever heard that term?
Sure,
on the Arab street, people are saying that such and such happened, as if sort of every Arab country is the same, and everybody in the street has the same view, and it's all rumor and gossip and myth. Well, no, I mean, the people we were talking to were, for the most part, thoughtful, well-educated Afghans, and they were coming up with good, creative proposals to try and solve the problems in their country. Now, there's no guarantee they would have worked, but I wish the heck they would have been tried. And as I like to say when I talk about this, one thing notably missing from the entire 4 days of brainstorms was nobody said, what we need right now is another foreign intervention. What we really need is for the United States to come in and start bombing. That's what we need.
Yeah.
Nobody said that. They were so opposed to that.
Yeah. Well, they clearly, they clearly didn't have any way to stop it, even though they knew about it ahead of time.
Yeah.
Graeme, I'm equally impressed by your take on the anthrax attacks. I really was quite surprised when I listened to your presentations on the anthrax attacks, and to me, it like the lack of awareness of the significance of the fact of and significance of the pre-planning of the invasion of Afghanistan. This is another area where folks are not as up to speed as they should be, and you've studied this to great effect. And I would just like you to lay out for us the significance of the anthrax attacks in your view. Do you think that they are connected to the 9/11 attacks? And if you do you think that they shed light on the 9/11 attacks?
Yes to both questions. First, I guess I feel my usual need to say I don't consider myself a great scholar on the anthrax attacks. There are some people who've been studying them for years, Merrill Ness, Barbara Rosenberg, Philip Saracen, who wrote a fine book on the anthrax attacks in 2006, published by Harvard University Press. Barry Kissin, Barbara Honegger. So just my hats off to those people, okay? I got into it just probably a couple of years ago because I thought this is a huge gap in my knowledge. Here I have been studying 9/11, and here were these other attacks that happened in the same time period, just slightly afterwards, which were obviously very important, and which I keep hearing these grave questions about them. They came from the U.S. military-industrial complex or something. And I thought, well, that's not a minor thing. If that's true, then that's huge. So I thought, I can't just keep repeating what other people say. I need to do my research. So I took a few months off. I got all the books I could. I got all the articles I could, the newspaper articles that were published at the time, blah, 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 and went through it. And so all I've tried to do is, first of all, to be able to cook down, to boil down some of the essentials, the things that I think are most important. And secondly, to try and link them to 9/11, because not all the great anthrax researchers have related them to 9/11, and not all of them have been willing to say that 9/11 was a fraud. They know anthrax. They know the anthrax attacks were a fraud, but they don't all realize 9/11 was too. And you kind of have to see the two together.
Yes.
So I'm not sure. Would you like me to sum up why I think they're connected, or how they're connected?
Well, first I'd like you to describe when they occurred, and maybe describe a couple of the letters that were associated with them, and what it appeared from your semantic, your literary analysis of the letters, what the subtexts were, what the subliminal messages of the letters were, and then talk about the evolution of the official account of the anthrax attacks, who made them, what they contained, etc., as that unfolded. Okay. I guess I'm asking you to talk about everything.
That's a big order. Well, anyway, I'll start with the letters themselves. There were several letters that were sent out, but only a couple were preserved. Most of these letters, by the way, went to the press, or I should say the media more generally, not all to newspapers, and a couple went to Democratic senators, Leahy and Daschle. Now, the first anthrax letter that was recovered, and you can find this on the FBI website, it has the date at the top, which is 9/11. It's actually written 09-11-01, so it writes 9/11 at the top. And the next letter that was recovered, by the way, which was mailed much later, has exactly the same date at the top. So let's just stop and think about that for a minute. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, these people are trying to tie in their action to the 9/11 attacks. There's no evidence whatsoever that these were actually mailed on 9/11. But right. They put the date 9/11 in big printed letters right at the top. And they're saying to us, okay, we're the same people. And so here's what the first letter reads. And this is, it's hand printed. It says, "This is next. Take penicillin now." Penicillin being spelled wrong. "Death to America, death to Israel. Allah is great." Okay, that's it. It's short, okay? And it has anthrax. I think they had about 2 grams, as I recall, of anthrax in each of these letters, with about 1 trillion spores per gram, if I remember correctly. Highly, highly, highly concentrated, highly refined, highly dangerous, especially the ones sent to the senator. So I look at the letter and I say, okay, first thing, they're obviously trying to tie it into 9/11. We're the same guys. Hello, here we are. Mm-hmm. Then obviously they're saying, we're extremist Muslims. This is like a parody of the guys that are being shown on TV all the time, waving their fists, "Death to America, death to Israel." Allah is great. They spell penicillin wrong. Both letters are written in clumsy English.
And the handwriting is real rough. They look real crummy.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, when I read these, I think of old Hollywood movies where, white guys with shoe polish on their faces pretending to be Indians say stuff like, "Red man kill heap big white man. Me got him anthrax. Me kill him lots, you betcha." In other words, it's all kinds of racial stereotypes and so on. So that the idea is that somehow these guys have in their letter, in their envelope, and I'm speaking now especially of the letters to the senators, because that anthrax was a bit different than the other ones. This is highly sophisticated, weaponized anthrax, which is extremely difficult to prepare, and obviously came from highly sophisticated scientific laboratories. So here you've got this highly sophisticated product, and then you've got these guys who are so stupid and so ill-trained that they can't do like a spell check, they can't get someone to proofread it for idiomatic English. And so I look at that and I say, what's going on? What is the message here? Now, it could be that the people who put this together are just stupid and that they're not aware of this contradiction. But I don't think they were stupid. I think there's a double message, because they're supposed to be indicating to us, and by the way, some of this is speculation, and I don't normally speculate publicly when I talk about these issues, but sometimes, as long as we make it clear it is speculation, it's important to do. So I'm saying I think we're being told there's a double perpetrator. They're the field operatives, the guys on the ground who, are writing this in their crummy handwriting and misspelling penicillin and dropping it in the mailbox. And these are guys like so-called Al-Qaeda, right? Like the 19 hijackers. I mean, they're extremist Muslims, so-called, and they're this and they're that. But then behind them somehow is the supplier of the anthrax. And this obviously is not Al-Qaeda, who is in no position to produce this kind of sophisticated process. So who is it? And it's pretty clear it's meant to be Iraq. So what I'm saying is that there's lots of corroborating evidence that these letters and the anthrax in them are supposed to be telling us that there are two perps working together. Now let me just quote from October 15th, the Wall Street Journal. They have a featured article on the anthrax mailings. I'm quoting now, several circumstantial links to Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network are already known. Okay, so there's Al-Qaeda involved. But bin Laden couldn't be doing all this in Afghan caves. The leading supplier suspect has to be Iraq. And let me quote from roughly the same time, just I think a day before, The Guardian, which says this: American investigators probing anthrax outbreaks in Florida and New York believe they have all the hallmarks of a terrorist attack and have named Iraq as prime suspect, as the source of the deadly spores. Their inquiries are adding to what U.S. hawks say is a growing mass of evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved, possibly indirectly, with the September 11th hijackers. And then they go on to talk about strikes, military strikes on Iraq could be imminent. So what we get here, what we got very stridently and repeatedly from U.S. media during October 2001 was the idea that the anthrax attacks, first of all, were the second blow in a series of blows of the United States. That they were from essentially the same groups. They had done 9/11, now starting a week later they're doing the anthrax, and that there were two parties involved, and that they were Al-Qaeda, based at that point in Afghanistan, so we have to invade Afghanistan, and Iraq, so we're going to have to invade Iraq. We heard this message again and again. ABC News several times said that they had independent, credible sources that said that an analysis of the anthrax spores showed that they were coated with bentonite, which is a substance that the Iraqis used to weaponize their anthrax, and that this was, therefore, Saddam Hussein's signature. Now, this was all false, by the way, and was quite quickly proven to be, it was complete fabrication. And ABC has refused to this day to reveal their so-called independent, confidential sources for this baloney. But the point is, I think it's pretty clear, and Philip Saracen makes this point very well in his 2006 book called Anthrax, Bioterror as Fact and Fantasy. His point is that the anthrax attacks were clearly intended to expand the war on terror to include Iraq, and that they were fraudulent, that they were an inside job, so on and so forth. So, I think that what I'm trying to say is even a careful reading of these letters can give you hints about this. The crude letter, the sophisticated substance inside. And there's another thing to look at here, which is quite striking when you think about it, and that is that there was a military exercise, one of these big simulations they run, 3 months before 9/11 in Washington at Air Force Andrews Base, called Operation, I don't know if it was Operation, but anyway, Dark Winter. Okay, so what was Dark Winter? Dark Winter was a simulated bioweapons attack on the United States. Now, in this simulation, it was smallpox rather than anthrax. But in other respects, it bears an uncanny resemblance to what happened 3 months later. As the simulation unfolds and the panic escalates in the United States and the deaths escalate, and so eventually becomes clear that Iraq is the source of the smallpox. Letters are mailed to the media with smallpox materials in them, just as happened later. And in this exercise, Iraq uses an intermediary group, which is, I don't believe it's explicitly called Al-Qaeda, but one assumes that it's made up of Muslims, an intermediary on-the-ground group to actually deliver the material. Okay, and it seems to me that was scripted, that was fiction, and what became clear pretty soon was that what happened in October was also scripted. It was also fiction. All this stuff about Al-Qaeda, and Iraq delivering this anthrax, it was fiction, and this fiction fell apart quite quickly, and that's one of the reasons it's important to discuss it, because 9/11, to untangle that one took us quite a while. I mean, I think we've untangled it pretty well now. We've proven that the official story is false, and we can go into that later. But with anthrax, my gosh, by November, there were, important figures already saying, I think by November, Tom Ridge, his full Department of Homeland Security hadn't been established. I think it was just called an office at that time, but I assume Ridge hadn't been appointed yet when this operation was planned, and therefore they hadn't brought him into the loop. He hadn't been briefed, because there he was in November saying, well, actually, there isn't any bentonite in this stuff. It doesn't have an Iraqi signature. And by January of 2002, he was saying, you know what, guys, it looks like it was made in our own labs, because it's the Ames strain of anthrax, which essentially was first isolated in the United States, shared among U.S. labs and U.S. allies' labs. It wasn't shared with Al-Qaeda. Iraq didn't have it. And the way it was weaponized with the use of silica to make it more easy to aerosolize the anthrax, all of this looked like American methods that were used in a very small number of U.S. military and intelligence laboratories. And so this was already coming out within a few months. And by the time, let me just grab the paper here, by the time of October 2002, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology publishes their little newsletter, which I've got right in front of me. They were asked to examine the anthrax, and they were set up to do it, so they did it. And they found, it was weaponized, it was aerosolized, but it wasn't the method the Iraqis used. Here's what they say, I'm quoting now. There was silica added, so they say silica prevents the anthrax from aggregating, making it easier to aerosolize, in other words, to disperse in the air, which is what kills people. Significantly, we noted the absence of aluminum with the silica. This combination had previously been found in anthrax produced by Iraq. So they're exonerating Iraq. They're laying waste to this whole story. I can only assume that there were key players within the military intelligence community that just weren't briefed. They weren't brought in on this, and so this was a major goof. So the anthrax story fell apart very quickly, and by the beginning of 2002, the FBI had to deal with the fact that this stuff, which killed Americans, it killed 5 people, it infected 17 others and wounded some of them very badly, caused panic in the nation, was apparently meant to threaten and possibly kill 2 senators who could have blocked the passage of the U.S. Patriot Act. But this whole thing was a false flag operation. It really was. I mean, the FBI now admits that, okay? In other words, it was done by somebody, or buddies in the plural, within the U.S. military intelligence community who pretended to be extremist Muslims and cooked the whole thing up in order to kill and terrorize the American population. And think about it. They didn't just crash airliners. They actually used weapons of mass destruction on the homeland of the U.S. Wow.
And they launched it 1 week after September 11th.
Right. So, in other words...
So they had it ready to go.
Yeah, they had it ready to go, because it isn't easy to prepare this stuff. It takes a long time, and it takes a multidisciplinary team. And that's why I perhaps should say another word here. The FBI has come out with what I would call a limited hangout position. In other words, where you reveal part of the truth so that you won't have to reveal the really dangerous truth. So they now admit that it comes from the heart of the U.S. military intelligence community, but they say it was a lone nut. And you can never yeah, right, we've heard that one before. And you can never really rule out lone nuts. I mean, they infect society here and there and everywhere. You know, when you discover one, it's too bad, but it doesn't tell you anything very significant, because these people are irrational, unpredictable. And they eventually settled on Dr. Bruce Ivins, who worked at USAMRIID in, a U.S. military research institute in Fort Detrick, Maryland. He had cooperated with, he had done a lot to help them with their investigation, but they turned on him and said, no, we think it's him. And they came out publicly and said that 1 week after he died. And it's really quite cruel when you think of it. I mean, it appears that I don't know whether they literally assassinated him. It's possible. More likely, they drove him to an emotional crisis. They claim he took his life with an overdose of Tylenol because of, they say this is proof of his guilt. Well, it isn't proof of his guilt at all. If it's a proof of anything, it's that they hounded him. They hounded his family, his children, his co-workers. They told him they were going to nail him. They were going to use the death penalty. The one thing we know is that he was in a terrible emotional crisis. However, did he take his life? I have no idea. They performed no autopsy. Can you imagine that? So no. We don't know. Yeah, we don't know if he killed him. But anyway, he died, the poor guy, after all the crap they laid on him. And then a week later they come out and say, he's the guy who did it. And, the fact that he killed himself just shows, that he did it out of guilt. And I just find that so outrageous. And, last year they published a 92-page document in which they lay out the case for Bruce Ivins as the killer. And I just think the whole thing is almost beneath discussion. At best, at its very strongest, they have some circumstantial evidence of his involvement. At its worst, it is the kind of thing that I would fail if an undergraduate handed me a paper like that. It is so outrageous. So they never show that he did this. They never show he was involved in this. But the guy will never have a chance to defend himself in court. The best he can do is his lawyer, fortunately, has given a couple of very good interviews, which you can find on the Internet, explaining the absurdity and the insufficiency and the inadequacy of the evidence against him. Unfortunately, a number of his co-workers, former boss, these people have come out in his support and have said this is nonsense. So here's the FBI. They're going to do damage control. Yes, we have to admit it came from our labs, from highly, highly secure places. It's not easy to get anthrax out of these things. But it was a lone nut. And I'm saying, if you look at the evidence carefully, you find not only is it not Bruce Ivins, it can't be any individual. It's a group, and this group nested in the heart of the military, industrial, intelligence community in the U.S. And there's every reason to believe this group was linked to, or was in fact identical with, the group that pulled off 9/11.
That's the key point, and I agree with you based on what you lay out about the anthrax attacks. And there's another dimension which I think is important to go into here, which is the connections between the 9/11 alleged hijackers, right, where they were located there in Florida, where the anthrax attacks occurred, also in the same area, and then this amazing story of Muhammad Atta and his application for, or his attempt to get hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy a crop duster. Would you lay that out for us?
Yeah.
And the implications that has.
Yeah. Let me just back up for a minute to explain why this is important. So, again, often if I give a talk on 9/11, I'll start with a few words now about the Anthrax attacks. And generally, my point is a very, I suppose you could say basic or vague, but nonetheless important. It's meant to answer people who say, oh, the government would never do this, or, the military-industrial complex would never kill Americans, or they'd never do a false flag, and those kinds of general objections. I say, well, look, we know enough about the Anthrax attacks that even the FBI admits that, in fact, all of this was done, and it was done a week after 9/11. So what you believe, if you reject that 9/11 was an inside job and a false flag attack, you're saying that on 9/11, real extremist Muslims attacked the United States, spread terror, killed Americans, and so on. And a week later, fake extremist Muslims attacked the United States, killed people, caused panic, and so on. Now, Of course, it's possible that real ones did it and then fake ones did it. But I would think any rational human being learning about the Anthrax attacks would say, well, gee, wait a minute. If the fake Muslims did it starting on September 18th, maybe the other ones were fake too. So that's the way I generally use Anthrax in my general 9/11 talks. However,
yes,
what you're asking is a more specific thing. You're saying, okay, that may be useful, but is there evidence that the same people actually were involved? In other words, that there were connections between the perpetrators of the Anthrax attacks and the so-called 19 hijackers on 9/11. And I'm saying, yeah, there is evidence that they were connected. And it's evidence of various kinds. So we can start with what you mentioned, the Florida connection. At least 14 out of the 19 so-called hijackers had been active in Florida. Florida is a really important region for this whole 9/11 operation. And, I generally provide a map of the places in Florida where these guys were active, and it's the southeastern shore of seaboard of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And it's right in the middle of that area where the first anthrax victim died. His name was Robert Stevens. Now, by itself, that may not seem like a very big coincidence, although if you look at a map of the United States and you see what a small area that is, it's going to at least raise a few flags for you.
Yes.
But when we begin to follow the Robert Stevens trail a little bit, it gets even fishier. Now, Robert Stevens was a photo editor at a tabloid in, I believe it was Boca Raton, and the tabloid was called The Sun. It was owned by the same company that owned the National Enquirer. Now, at that time when he was working at The Sun, the general editor of the paper was a guy named Mike Irish. And Mike Irish's wife, Gloria, knew 2 of the 19 hijackers. In fact, she not only knew them, she was a real estate agent, and she had procured apartments for them. So here's the wife of the editor of the magazine finding apartments for Hamza al-Ghamdi and Marwan al-Shehi. And here's Mohammed Atta, the scary leader, co-signing on Marwan al-Shehi's lease.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, there are 3 hijackers who are all connected to the Irishes and therefore to the Sun, where the first death occurs. Now, again, that could be coincidence, but the odds are pretty slim at this point. At this point, what I begin to see is that somebody's they're not trying to hide the link, they're trying to make the link. That there's these 19 hijackers are somehow connected to the Anthrax stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we look further, I mean, again, I'm not a major researcher on this, but I have found 5 incidents in which there is this kind of connection. And after a while, I say, I'm getting tired of coincidences here. Something's going on. So many of these incidents have to do with crop duster planes as you know, crop duster planes are planes that have tanks in them where you put chemicals and stuff, and you then spray them over the ground. And planes like this have great potential for destruction if you are able to modify them so that they can carry chemical or biological weapons. So there's a whole bunch of stories, some of which appear to be quite true, where members of these 19 hijackers were trying to get a hold of crop dusters before 9/11. And we have, as I say, more than one incident. We have some incidents that go as late as about a month before 9/11, where these guys are still allegedly trying to get a hold of crop duster planes. But the particular story you asked me about has to do with Muhammad Atta and an incident that happened in the year 2000. And before I recount the incident, let me try and unpack what I think is going on here. Again, there's some speculation, but I think that it's supported by evidence. I think what we're being led to believe here is that the same guys who did 9/11, the so-called hijackers, were interested in launching a biological weapons attack, almost certainly anthrax, on the United States, but that's why they wanted crop duster planes. And George Bush virtually said that in a press conference later. You know, we have found that these guys are involved in crop duster planes, and there's potential for chemical and biological warfare. We also know that Iraq had been associated with anthrax for quite a while in the U.S. public's mind, because it did in fact have an anthrax program for some years before all this was destroyed by the UN inspectors, and it did in fact experiment with dispersing the anthrax through planes. And if you look at Colin Powell's 2003 presentation to the UN, in which he told one lie after another.
Yes, the infamous presentation.
The infamous presentation makes all this very clear. You know, anthrax equals Iraq. Iraq disperses this through planes. This is very dangerous. It could happen in the U.S. homeland and so on. So I'm giving you all this background because I think what's going on here is that with all these hijackers running around supposedly interested in crop dusters, that this is supposed to be laying a trail for us, suggesting that these people were going to do an anthrax attack, and of course, we're going to immediately think of Iraq again as the supplier. So anyway, with that as background, here's the little story of Muhammad Atta. I call it the story of Muhammad Atta Seeks Alone. Yeah, so this was told in detail by the lone officer involved. Her name is Janelle Bryant. It was told in 2002, but the incident supposedly happened in 2000. So Janelle Bryant was a lone officer for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This happened in the spring of 2000 in Florida. She's sitting in her office, and a man enters. He wants a loan. He identifies himself as Muhammad Atta. Now, first you got to think about this. This is a guy who was at that time supposedly planning one of the most important top-secret operations ever conducted in the U.S. homeland. Right? He's the guy who's supposedly leading up this extremely secret attack that's going to be happening. So you have to keep that in mind. He comes in. He says, "My name's Muhammad Atta," and he spells Atta for her just to make sure she gets it right. He says, "I'm from Afghanistan," which is also interesting because the real Atta was from Egypt. It's not clear why he would say he's from Afghanistan. "I'm from Afghanistan," and more or less he says, "You know, I'm just a young boy with a dream. I just arrived in the United States, and my dream is to dust American crops, and I want therefore." A loan of $650,000. Okay, this guy isn't an American citizen. He's just come in from Afghanistan. He walks into the office. "I want $650,000 so that I can buy a 6-seater aircraft and remove all the seats except the pilot seat and put a big chemical tank there so I can dust American crops." And I suppose she's probably bug-eyed by this point. She explains, Janelle Bryant, that he can't just walk out of her office with $650,000 in cash. There's a process here, and it's process of application. It's a bit complex, may take some time. As she's speaking about this, he grows agitated, this so-called Muhammad Atta. And by the way, I don't think he's the same guy who was born in Egypt at all. But anyway, this guy called himself Muhammad Atta grows agitated and says to her, "What's to prevent me from coming around the desk, cutting your throat, and taking the $650,000? And I'm thinking, okay, I think this is when you phone security or you yell really loudly. But Janelle Bryant says no, she didn't panic. She said, first of all, I don't have that amount of cash here, so it wouldn't be. Besides, I know karate. I know karate. So apparently no problem. They continued to discuss this amicably. She explains to him that in any case, you're not an American citizen, so you're not eligible. Now, at some point in this discussion, and it's not clear what the sequence of events is, but at some point in the discussion, the so-called Muhammad Atta sees an aerial photograph on the wall of her office, and it's a photograph of Washington, D.C., and he's really impressed. He says, this is the clearest, this is the best photograph of Washington, D.C. from the air that I've ever seen. Look at the Pentagon. Look at the White House. He actually mentions the Pentagon, which, of course, is later going to be attacked from the air. This is great. I have to buy this. I have to have this. He begins throwing cash on the desk. He says, no. She says, no, it's not for sale. It's a personal gift. So he gets frustrated again. How would you Americans feel if someone were to come to your country and destroy these monuments? Right? I'm sorry, I can't help laughing. This is the top secret terrorist talking here, right?
Right.
He's supposed to be keeping all this very private. Then, God knows what the connection is, he begins talking about the World Trade Center. I mean, here he is, he's sitting in Florida asking for a loan. He starts talking about the World Trade Center, what an interesting place it is. He wants to visit, and he asks Janelle Bryant what the security is like there. This apparently doesn't set off any bells for her at all. I guess she just says, I don't really know what the security is like.
Why'd you ask me?
Right.
Yeah.
And then, again, I don't know what the logical transition is, but at that point it seems appropriate to him to mention that in his country, meaning Afghanistan, there's a wonderful group called Al-Qaeda. And there's a marvelous leader called Osama bin Laden. And that Osama bin Laden will be famous someday. At which point, they stand up and shake hands in a friendly manner, and she gives him a referral to go off and try and get a loan from a bank. Now, that's the story that I call Muhammad Atta asks for a loan. And I say to myself, what do we make of this complete nonsense? I mean, is it just a fabricated story? It never happened? Or did it happen, in which case, who was actually involved and why were they involved? Now, I've corresponded with other researchers, including Elias Davidson, who's a good, solid European researcher. Elias says, I'm quite sure that the incident did happen. Bryant didn't just make it up. Mm-hmm. I'm going to assume for the moment that Elias is right, in which case we have to say, so who was this guy who came in and said all this stuff? And I think the answer is pretty clear. He wasn't a top-secret terrorist planning 9/11 or planning anthrax attacks. He was an operative who had been tasked with the job of laying down a real obvious trail that somebody was supposed to follow. And he came back, by the way, later to her again. And he and the other guys were hanging around airports asking people about their crop duster planes and were they for sale, and all this stuff was going on. And I think that all of this was supposed to signal, it was preparation, basically, for the actual anthrax attacks that occurred a week after 9/11. It was a way of saying, we are going to strike you, and then we're going to strike you again with a biological attack, and it's all going to point to the obvious country in the world that has anthrax, that sprays it from airplanes, and that's Iraq. So this is an attempt to set up Iraq. They tried to set up Iraq for 9/11 and make connections, over a period of years, but it wasn't easy, and it failed. If they had been able to do what they intended and to nail Iraq for the Anthrax attacks, that whole invasion of Iraq would have been much more easy. They wouldn't have had all the trouble with the UN that they had. So you see, we see here, I think, careful attempts to set up Afghanistan and Iraq, both of which, the plans to invade them both had been already laid well before this. And, you know, the attempt to set up Afghanistan went pretty well. The one to set up Iraq, the whole Anthrax thing, was botched, okay? And ever since then, the FBI has been trying to cover the trail. And so, you know, in October and November 2001, it was assumed that these two terrorist attacks were connected, and we're being told about, you know, the Irishes and the crop duster. All crop duster planes in the United States were grounded, were ordered to the ground on September 16th because of this threat. Okay.
Yeah.
And, you know, and we had one of these 9/11 hijackers who had come to a doctor with a big, strange black lesion on his leg sometime before 9/11. Well, of course, that's a prime characteristic of cutaneous anthrax infection. It's called anthrax from the word anthracite, coal. It has a coal black lesion. So there he is. Again, it looked like, oh, they've been experimenting with anthrax. So you see my point. We were supposed to believe that the same group carried out 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, and it was a double perpetrator. It was Al-Qaeda based in Afghanistan, and it was the state of Iraq, and we're going to invade them both. And Kenneth Edelman, who was a former high government official in the Reagan administration, laid it all out pretty clearly in an interview in October 2001. He said, look, I think George Bush has a mission. It's almost a divine mission, and that is to attack terrorism and states that, you know, have WMD. They said you can't always find terrorist groups and destroy them, but by God, you can find the countries that sponsor them and you can destroy them. And he says, in the very next breath, Afghanistan and Iraq are the countries we have to go after. They may not be weak, but they're not strong. We can get them. He says, I don't have any actual evidence that Iraq was involved in this thing, but I feel it. I feel it, okay? Which apparently was enough at the time. So to sum it up, these countries of Afghanistan and Iraq, and this amorphous group called Al-Qaeda, which is so useful because you can never pin it down, and it's always scary, and you never know where they are. These people were set up well in advance. These invasions were planned well in advance. And we need to look at the relationship between the anthrax attacks and the 9/11 attacks, because, yes, they were connected. They were the same people behind them all. And the very fact that the anthrax attack thing fell apart so quickly, you know, is one of the reasons we have to keep talking about it. And we can't let the media go silent on it, which is what they've done. They want to forget that it ever happened. No, we don't forget that it happened. We remember it happened.
Yeah, this seems like one of the most productive avenues of penetration into who the actual perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks were, because of these links, and because this breach has been made into their obscurity by the failure to contain, the official account, to sustain the official account of the anthrax attacks. We can actually use that as a way into figuring out who is involved in 9/11. I think it's an extraordinary. I think you certainly put it together more succinctly and with the proper emphasis, proper from the standpoint of people who are principally concerned about 9/11 truth. So I think that's an extraordinarily powerful analysis. We also have evidence, other independent evidence, that the planning for the attack on Iraq was apparently the highest priority of the Bush administration on day one. That guy Clark, the former anti-terror czar or whatever, he attested that in early meetings the Bush administration was all about going into Iraq.
That's right. That's right. Iraq was in the crosshairs even years.
And then we have people in Afghanistan and Pakistan saying, they're planning to, and India saying they've got the war plan in Afghanistan ahead of time. So just like you said, these two areas were pre-planned well ahead, and these attacks were the pretexts for them.
That's right. And the gentleman who stood up in Peshawar and talked about oil had a lot going for him there. That would be another subject, but I guess our time's almost up, so all the other things we were going to talk about, maybe some other time.
I would love that. Would you be willing to come on again in the future?
Oh, sure.
Okay. I would just like then to close with your reflections on the ignorance in the anti-war movement about these crucial events and the continuing ignorance. And those people that you mentioned in their presentations recently, one has to assume that they genuinely are ignorant. We've only got 1 minute left, but would you like to say something about this ignorance? Yeah, well, it's the reason I gave a talk in New York a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, on 9/11 and the peace movement or whatever. I'm tempted sometimes to just denounce everybody, but it's no good. It's no good. I mean, I am a member of the peace movement. Who am I denouncing? It doesn't work to denounce. We have to just somehow say, look, my friends, your hearts are in the right place, and you're smart people, and on other subjects, you're perfectly capable of approaching governments and military organizations with suspicion. On this one, you seem to not get it. So please allow me to give a talk to you. This is what I'm trying to do in my hometown. And I finally have been able to give several talks and to slowly persuade a few people and to bring visiting speakers. So I'll be bringing Niels Harrit, the nanothermite guy, in a couple of weeks to give a talk at my university. And I think we're making slow progress. And then, final word, this coming September 11th, we're putting on 4 days of citizens' hearings in Canada, in which a lot of the big researchers will be there. And we're going to record these and transcribe them and all kinds. Well, fantastic. Graeme, I'm sorry that we've run out of time. Your work is amazingly fine. It's truly excellent, and I think everybody got a feeling for the quality of, you may be depending upon others, but you have a way of penetrating and laying out the significance better than most, and I want to thank you very much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Todd. I'm honored to have been on your show, and thanks for doing your own research on this so well.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.